Hi, I'm Professor Angus Kress Gillespie from the American Studies Department at Rutgers University, and I'm here today with author Michael Aaron Rockland, who's written many books. As a writer myself, I'm very concerned with productivity. I've tried just about every trick in the book. What's worked for me has been good old-fashioned to-do lists, set schedules, and long-term plans. I set a schedule where I can work productively, often very early in the morning. I have a basic routine in place for regular activities, and I'm very attached to my to-do list. I've long admired Michael's productivity, so I'm hoping today to learn some new tactics and strategies from the master, and I'm eager to share those with you. Michael, you've written many books over the years, but from time to time, as I understand it, you've paired the writing of a novel with the writing of a nonfiction book. First example that I could think of along those lines would be you were writing the novel A Bliss Case, but along with it, you were doing a nonfiction book about the New Jersey Turnpike. And as I recall, that was the genesis, the beginning of your concept of doing two things at the same time. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yes, that's certainly how it started. And in fact, you're the one who started it. You should take some credit. This was my first novel, and I was having a lot of trouble with it. And you were thinking about writing a book on the New Jersey Turnpike. And
which I kept putting off.
Right, yeah. Right. I had to lure you back from the Philippines to do the book. Anyway, I agreed to do the book on the Turnpike almost for therapy, thinking, given my frustrations with the novel of Bliss Case.
You kept hitting roadblocks with the novel.
And suddenly you asked me to join you in doing a book on the Turnpike.
To co-author the book, yeah.
Yeah, that it would I thought it would somehow take my mind off the novel, which sounds silly because you think your mind ought to be on the novel. There's a lot of difference between the mind and the imagination. And it was when I started to write the Turnpike book with you that I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the novel. And as I began to now successfully continue with the novel, is when I got all my ideas for the Turnpike book. And so what I've learned is that if I work on two things at the same time, in this case fiction and nonfiction, which most people think is crazy. How can you do fiction and nonfiction? It's precisely their difference, you see, which is helpful to me. It frees up my mind. And so I went ahead, and ironically, those books came out in the same month, and people thought, holy mackerel, the guy wrote these two books that came out in the same month. Because one of them I did with you. But I was working on both of them for some years. The novel I'd been working on for 5 years until I started to work on the Turnpike book with you. And then everything about the novel fell into place. I think the reason it may work for me is precisely because all of my eggs are not in one basket. And when all of my eggs are not in one basket, I have this, who cares? I have this devil-may-care attitude, which frees up my imagination.
And I think it happened again in the case of the novel Stones and your nonfiction book about the George Washington Bridge.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
How did that work?
the very same thing.
What was Stones about?
Stones was kind of a family story. It was based, it all takes place in one day, and it was based on a trip I would make with my mother. My father had died, and he used to take my mother to all the family cemeteries out on Long Island and graves and whatnot. And now I was taking her, and I did this for 16 or 17 years, every year around the Jewish holidays in the fall. And then I began to almost step back from the experience, an all-day thing, driving to the Bronx, picking my mother, going out to Long Island, et cetera. It was about a 14-hour day. And now I began to step back from it and began to look at it artistically. Okay? But I was still having a lot of trouble with it. But I was now writing the first edition of a book on the George Washington Bridge, because there have been two. And remembering the experience I'd had with a Bliss Case, the novel, and the book Looking for America on the New Jersey Turnpike, now I knew exactly what was happening. And I realized that doing the two at the same time loosened me up. And when you loose is when your imagination flows. It was my own solution to the age-old problem of writer's block. And I cured my writer's block by trying to write two books at the same time instead of one. I mean, it's really strange, but it worked.
Tell me, what was a Bliss Case about?
Well, a Bliss Case was about a Rutgers professor. It was based on a real Rutgers professor who joined a cult. He joined the cult of the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh that many of us may remember. And I was having, as I say, all kinds of trouble with it until I signed up to do the Turnpike book with you, and then everything fell into place. And not to brag too much, both of those books were tremendous successes. A Bliss Case was on the New York Times Best Books of the Year list, and it was my first novel. And I knew that it had worked because I had loosened up about it. I was relaxed about it. Now my imagination was just flowing. And it's your fault, because you invited me to do the Turnpike book. And also, I think whatever contributions I made to the Turnpike book came out of the fact that I was writing this novel.
And in what sense was the Turnpike book a success?
Oh, well, again, not to brag, because I'm sort of bragging for both of us here in a way. The book came out, it sold very well, it still sells. Indeed, Rutgers University Press is now considering doing a new edition of it, as we know. And then the State Library came out with a book, a list of what they called the 10 best books ever written on New Jersey or by a New Jerseyan. And our book, the Turnpike book, was on the list. But when you look at that list, it had Walt Whitman, who in his last years was living in Camden. It had F. Scott Fitzgerald, his novel about Princeton. It had Philip Roth, it had Allen Ginsberg, it had Stephen Crane and some other people. I remember you and I joking at the time, thinking they must have been desperate for a 10th or something. But to find ourselves on that list was really extraordinary and terribly flattering. But at the same time, I had this real sense that the two books had, for me anyway, had immensely helped one another.
And as I recall, there's a third example of this pairing of fiction and nonfiction. You were writing the novel Married to Hitler as you were working on the George Washington Bridge nonfiction book. How did that work?
Yes, well, I was asked to do a new edition of the George Washington Bridge book, which came out in 2020. The first one came out much earlier, 2008. And I was asked to do it because of Bridgegate. They felt that that story had to be covered, and some other things, tragedies of all sorts that had happened on the bridge and whatnot. And so I did the new edition of the George Washington Bridge. So that wasn't a whole book, but it was a big chunk of a book at the same time that I was writing the novel Married to Hitler. Pretty improbable title. It's not about Eva Braun, who married him for 5 minutes and then they shot themselves. It's what one person says to another, that you're obsessed with Hitler, you're stuck on Hitler, you're practically married to Hitler. That's where the title comes from.
What is Married to Hitler about?
Well, a young to middle-aged Jewish man going through a divorce decides to drive west and see the country. And he arrives at the Grand Canyon, and through a strange series of circumstances ends up with a beautiful woman as his roommate. They were both trying to save money at the lodge. That's at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and he later finds out all his life he's hated everything Germanic, the language even. He had a pair of scissors that they made in Germany and threw them out. The Holocaust is something which absolutely hangs over his life. And he meets this woman and he falls madly in love with her, and only later finds out she's German. This is the beginning of his restitution, if you will. The beginning of his seeing that she's not responsible for what her grandparents did. And indeed, her mother, she was conceived after her mother was gang raped by Russian soldiers coming into Eastern Germany, that all the suffering, well, most of it, but not all the suffering, was Jewish, that the issue was much more complicated, and that there were even Germans for whom one could have sympathy, not to mention he's in love with this woman. It becomes much more complicated than that in terms of her sexuality. And it goes on from there as well, so that it's really a novel about overcoming prejudices of all kinds.
So we've looked, all three cases, there was a balance between fiction and nonfiction, and the fact that you were working on a piece of nonfiction gave you relief from the imaginative toil of working on a novel.
Yes, but I think vice versa as well. Vice versa as well. It was, while I'm working on Project A is when I keep getting ideas for A. I'm sorry, when I'm working on Project B is when I get all the ideas for A. When I'm working on A, I never get any ideas about A. I get ideas about B.
Yeah.
Now, this might be some sort of personal schizophrenia of mine. I don't know. I can't swear that this would work for others, but it works beautifully for me. writer's block is something I don't even think about anymore.
So it's a very interesting technique. You're able to continue because you're switching back and forth.
Right.
And I guess when you're working on A, you're not worried about B. And so when you return to B, you're more comfortable somehow.
Yeah, or not only that, I returned to B with a million ideas about B that I got while working on A.
In the very beginning, what inspired you to take up writing?
I think I wanted to be a writer from the age of 16. I've recently retired as a professor at Rutgers after a half century. I certainly have written scholarly books, but I'd rather think of myself as an artist rather than as a scholar. And I remember the book that got me going. It was Sherwin Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. I read that book and I said, I want to do that. And I was at age 16 in high school. And that became my ambition, which...
And when did you actually start the writing?
Like most of us, I had to write a doctoral dissertation. I happened to be in the diplomatic service then. And maybe that's another way in which you find what you want to do when you're doing something else.
Yeah.
I happened to be serving as a cultural attaché in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And I uncovered a figure there that no one in the United States knew anything about. And thought, wow, and wrote back to the University of Minnesota where I'd done my graduate work, and they said, it was the quickest approval of a doctoral dissertation in history, I think. They said, I got a 2-word response back, said, do it. Huh. Because I was writing about somebody who had written a great deal about the United States.
Who was it?
His name was Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, maybe the greatest president in Argentine history. And somebody was, and that's another funny thing. I'm sitting in, I was a junior officer, I'm sitting in one of the other more senior fellows' offices, and I get this feeling that there's something looking at me. And I think, oh, am I crazy? But I look down, and his wastepaper basket is there. And there's a little head in his wastepaper basket, a bust of someone. And I said, who's that? And he says, I don't know, I don't care. It's been in my office all these years. I got sick of it, and I threw it out today. I'm thinking, what if I had been there the day before or the day after? And I said, well, since it wasn't either Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, I said, can I have it? And he said, sure, take it. Had a busted nose, which I fixed with chewing gum. Anyway, I took it to my office, where I had a meeting the next day with a bunch of Argentines with whom I was planning a jazz concert in a stadium in Buenos Aires. And when they came into my office, they said, pero usted es Sarmientista? You're a Sarmiento guy? And I said, who? And they went on to say that he was a friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Longfellow and Horace Mann, all of these distinguished figures of the mid-19th century, that I thought, wow. and so I wrote to Minnesota, and as I say, they came back and said, do it. So it immensely helped me in terms of that. So that was my first book. And it was a scholarly book. And as I say, I can do that. I do that. But I'd rather think of myself as a writer, artist, than as a scholar, although that was pure scholarship.
There's certainly a piece of good luck to have found that piece
Yes.
of sculpture, because the Argentines were the ones who called your attention to the Americana connections.
Exactly. That they did. I would have just had it on my shelf just because I had the smallest office in the embassy. It was sort of a closet, and at least this was some art on,
Yeah.
and I didn't even know who it was.
What a lucky break.
Well, there was another lucky break, a very unfortunate one. There was somebody, an American at Princeton University, who had written some on Sarmiento already and was going on to do so. And a very distinguished young man who, at his own birthday party, said to all his friends, and they were drinking, he said, "You know, I can put a pistol to my head with one bullet in it, and I'll never pull the trigger. I can hear which chamber." You see where this is going. Well, about the fourth time, and he said, "Please don't do it, please don't do it." He blew his brains out. And suddenly, between my discovering this figure and then the other person who had really discovered him before I did, had removed himself. I never met him. I mean, it's a terribly tragic story. Nevertheless, I prospered.
Changing subjects a bit, what advice would you give to a new writer just starting out?
I would simply say you've got to find a way to let your imaginative resources, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, to get your imaginative resources clicking. Now, my way we've discussed. There might be a better way. But how do you get to relax? How do you stop catastrophizing? How do you think that this is the only book and you've got to make it perfect, and et cetera? And again, my way, I'd written a bunch of books before this, but they were always a struggle. Writing comes, usually people are more prolific when they're younger. I've been more prolific as I've gotten older. And through this very strange way of doing things.
In your opinion, what's the most important element of good writing?
Tell a good story. So much of the scholarly writing that you and I have seen is just bad writing. You've taken something which is fairly simple and you've made it as complicated as possible. Tell a good story. Even if you're writing history, let's remember the last part, or herstory, as we say sometimes these days, history or herstory. Tell a good story. What's the story what's the story that's going to interest anyone? And frankly, I find in academia that the sorts of things that are often written, especially for scholarly journals, not always, but often, is just bad writing. It's really not that complicated. You're not telling a good story. You're using a bunch of fancy words that nobody else understands, and so you think that you're smarter than they are because they don't know those words or they don't use those words. Tell a good story.
And how do you come up with titles for your book? For example, let's take the Bliss Case. How do you come up with a title like that?
Well, that was actually the second title. The third section of the novel is called A Bliss Case, and it's told by the wife of the professor who leaves her to go join this cult in India. And by the way, here's an interesting thing. I wrote a bunch of this novel takes place in India, and I had never been in India. And you can say, well, how can you write about India? You've never been in India. Well, I'd seen Indian movies. I'd read some books about India. The book came out and was such a success that the State Department, which I was once in, invited me for a 2-week lecture trip all around India.
Wow.
And the Indians, the Indian writers who particularly would come to my talks, would come up to me and say, Mr. Rockland, you understand this better than we understand ourselves. You have really captured the very essence of India. And I said, that's funny, Mac, because I've never been here before. And now, since I've been in India, I wouldn't dream of writing about India. I think it would curtail my imagination. I was free to imagine anything I wanted to imagine. It's a novel. It doesn't have to be true. And I think that's why it worked.
You and I have been talking about how to write, and you've often said that it's important to be relaxed. And I think by being relaxed, what you mean is don't worry so much. Don't be uptight. And I guess the corollary of being relaxed is when you're truly relaxed, you're also self-confident. And the self-confidence.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. One other thing I'd mention is if you have a thought, write it down immediately, because if you don't write it down immediately, you're going to forget it. And especially in writing fiction, I would wake up in the middle of the night sometime and have an idea. And the last thing I wanted to do was to get out of bed and go to my study and get a pencil and paper and write this thing down. But I knew if I didn't do it, I'd lose it. I just wouldn't be able to remember what it was. And sometimes those are the best ideas. Sometimes they're like they at first glance seem to be crazy ideas, but not always. But often the crazy ideas are not crazy at all. They're the best ideas.
And just a final thought, yes, you get up in the middle of the night once in a while with an idea, but on a typical day, what is your writing schedule like?
I try to make sure I write, well, especially with fiction, I try to make sure I write every day, even if it's only 5 minutes. Fiction, let's face it, if you train to be a professor and you write a doctoral dissertation and you go all the way through graduate school, you're the worst candidate on the planet to write fiction. And I had to recover from being a professor to write fiction. My first novel, I only began to write novels later in life. My first novel, I was 54. When, usually, if you're going to be a novelist, you're writing it at 25, and by 54 you're burned out. I was just the reverse. Yeah. I started to click much later in life.
You unlearned scholarship almost as you turned to fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I have all the respect in the world for true scholarship if it's teaching us something we didn't know. But I find that some scholarship, again, as I suggested before, isn't teaching us anything. It's just confusing us and written in such an obtuse way. Again, as I said earlier, are you telling a good story? If you're telling a good story, it can be fiction, nonfiction, doesn't matter what it is. Are you telling a good story? If it's a good story, everybody wants to read it. If it isn't a good story, not even your mother would read it. So that's the game as I see it, yeah.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts about writing with us today here on East Brunswick Television. And I'm going to go home and try and put some of this into practice.
Okay. That'd be great.